Shalom. Welcome to Understanding the World with Rabbi David Kaufman. I'm joined in the studio by Mark Finkelstein, and this is the world in 5 minutes. So this week, the big topic that everyone is talking about is very clearly negotiations with Iran concerning its nuclear program. And what we found this week is that France seems to be of the same mind as Israel in wanting tougher sanctions and wanting to not make concessions to Iran just to get them to proceed with negotiations. The belief is from Iran and Israel, at least the basic belief is that the time to get Iran to make significant concessions is while the major sanctions are in place, and even to threaten to put more sanctions on unless Iran makes significant concessions. That to weaken those sanctions in favor of minor concessions by Iran actually makes the entire process much more difficult and probably results in a lasting agreement that will not accomplish the goals set out to restrict the Iranian nuclear program and make sure that it is not a threat to the nations around it and to the United States that would potentially result in a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. The White House and leadership of Israel are significantly at odds over this, and it's getting quite nasty in some places, as a matter of fact. We'll talk a little bit about that as the show progresses. The discussion that is going on right now is very reminiscent of 1938 and negotiations with the German leadership. And for Jews, this, I think, echoes much more strongly than it does for the general population. And that, I think, is why Israel advocates in general are reacting much more strongly to this. When you put on the table that we would rather accept a bad deal than face the possibility of war, and that is literally the discussion, you are bringing up terminology in such a way that echoes 1938 and peace in our time so strongly that it's virtually impossible to ignore. That is a major concern for the Jewish community, and it's a major concern for Israel. Finally, this week we also have, actually yesterday, a speech given by the Ayatollah Khomeini in which he called Israel the rabid dog of the Middle East and also said that Israelis are not human. And to this point, the United States has not condemned this speech by Iran, and this is very unsettling and very upsetting to the Israelis, not to mention to me. So let's talk about the fact that our administration should not be tolerating that, and any administration that I vote for or would consider voting for or that should be leading my country should not tolerate that either. So the fact that our State Department has not condemned that is very upsetting. And I'm waiting for not only a minor, it would be nice if he didn't use that language kind of condemnation, but we're really going to consider doing something much harsher in retaliation if that language doesn't change. It is not acceptable whatsoever, and we cannot be pushed around as a nation and allow our allies to be pushed around or demeaned like that without responding to it. It's simply not acceptable, and I find the conduct of our State Department unacceptable in not responding to it immediately, much less to this point. Finally, as part of our show, I want to talk about what I think is really the defining policy that's guided Middle East policy for the Obama administration since its beginning. And I call it the Obama Doctrine. It is based on the 2009 UN General Assembly speech given by President Obama, and it has some very important language in it that you will see echoed in what this administration has done over the last few years. It explains a lot of what otherwise might not make a whole lot of sense based on former American foreign policy. That has been the Week in 5 Minutes. We will be back shortly after this.
From the RE/MAX Real Estate Concept Studios, this is Webcast One Live.
I'm Brian Leach, owner and general manager of Service Legends. I brought along a couple of the home comfort heroes.
Hi, I'm Tammy Wells.
I am Nick Wondershad.
I'm administrative manager
I'm the senior technician
from Service Legends.
It seems like every good thing, when you feel it to the bone that it's good, there's a lot of hard work put behind it. I don't think that you can fake it and have it turn out good.
You know, if we seem like, okay, that's just weird, it's just a furnace, why would you believe so deeply in a furnace? It's not just that, you know, we want to show the world that you can have good service.
Yeah, I mean, it's your home.
You know, it's built into our daily trainings, it's built into our culture, that we're gonna do whatever it takes to have each client say they love us, period.
That's why we spend all the hours in the training that we do. And if we guarantee it's gonna be a good experience for you, or else it's free, what type of work do you think we're gonna do?
There is a guarantee.
Temperature selection guarantee, fixed right or it's free guarantee, comfort guarantee, best value guarantee. All of these guarantees hold us accountable to ensuring that we exceed your expectations. And if for whatever reason we'd fail and we can't make it right, we guarantee all of those guarantees with a 100% money back guarantee.
I mean, if you don't think that your technician can fix it right, are you gonna say that to a client? No.
You don't have to worry about having a technician come to your house.
We drug test, background check all of our team members. We put safe people in your home. Each and every one of our service techs, 400 hours a year in training.
You tell it the minute they walk in the door. They know what they're doing, they've done their homework, and they actually truly care about what you want.
Because at the end of the day, you're the person that makes sure I have a job.
They're gonna be listening. They're gonna wanna know what your challenges are. Then they're gonna come and give you options, and you get to choose.
If I'm there to help and I make it easy and painless, I did my job right that day.
Well, when it comes to your comfort, safety, and your family, you know, you don't necessarily go buy the most expensive, but you get the most bang for your buck.
Oh, it's worth it, because there's a lot of people that will find a way to get it to work right now and then leave and then come back, charge you again, and the cycle just repeats itself. So when I'm out there looking at the furnace, I want to find why it failed today. How can we change the part today with something that you're not going to have to worry about? Is it worth changing the part today? I mean, you can put a lot of money into a furnace. I can fix parts all day. There's good job security in that for me. But is it the right thing for you?
I get a lot of the phone calls of after the technicians are there. They're just in awe. They're like, wow, you guys are great. I mean, I don't even know what to say. You guys are great. Everything you did was perfect. It was great.
Keep going though, I like this.
Just give us a try. I'm gonna take all the risk.
I've got the time to make this right. I've got the support to make it right.
Just check us out.
And if you don't see the value in what we do,
I mean, fixed right or it's free or 100% money back.
enough said.
Shalom. Welcome back to Understanding the World with Rabbi David Kaufman. I'm joined in the studio by Mark Finkelstein of the Jewish Federation of Greater Des Moines. And for the most part, we're going to be talking about Iran today. And there was an article published this afternoon or promoted this afternoon, I should say, by Haaretz on its Twitter feed. It's actually written by JTA, the Jewish Telegraph Agency, talking about a conference a conference call with think tanks and advocacy groups sympathetic to the Obama administration's Iran strategy. Okay, so now here is a significant problem right off the bat. Okay, so the Obama administration had a conference call with groups that exclude a very significant portion of the American Jewish community, including the major Israel advocacy organizations. I'm kind of wondering which organizations were involved in this conversation. Mark?
I would think that the Brookings Institution was the primary think tank involved, and the Chaim Saban Center, which tends to support the administration's policy rather than the Washington Institute for Near East Studies.
And probably not AIPAC, and probably
certainly not AIPAC, but certainly the major think tank is the Brookings Institution, and perhaps the institutions in Washington D.C. that Shibli Telhami is related to. They tend to left of center to begin with, And they've been exploring topics over the past number of years that were seemingly looking for a loophole so to deal with, for instance, a Muslim Brotherhood.
Okay. So as we're looking at this, it's an interesting position already, and it shows that the Obama administration recognizes that there's certain groups that are in agreement with its policies and certain groups that are not, but it's not necessarily even getting the agreement of its own supporting institutions, which is why it's got which is why it needs to have a conference call, the next round of negotiations concerning the Iranian nuclear program begins in Geneva on Thursday. So this was an attempt to get support prior to those discussions.
Now, David, one of the issues of contention is that the United States has always told Israel, we are fully supportive of you and we will share whatever information. The problem seems to be that if there's something new that's coming to the fore, why wasn't it brokered to the degree that it's understood that we're going in different directions rather than lumping it in as a surprise? Surprises are always bad in the diplomatic field. They are usually the tail end of failed communications and invariably alienate allies.
Well, and in a case where we have been told repeatedly that the United States and Israel are working hand in hand and there's no daylight, we're in a situation now in which there's a lot of daylight.
Now part of that comes from defining what hand in hand means and the technical definitions of what security means and how do you arrange to discuss security issues in a contextual basis rather than a basis based on other factors. When you don't clarify those definitions to begin with, what you have what's called constructive ambiguity, which is used in basic negotiation technique, but fails at the very end when you have to sell the car without its motor. It invariably comes back and creates more trouble. It's, I think, a very bad technique, except for initially getting people to the table to discuss things they don't want to discuss to begin with.
And we're in a situation in which it came to light last week, I believe, that there have been long-term, at least for multiple months, secret negotiations between the United States and Iran. That the belief is that Valerie Jarrett was involved with those, although that has been denied by the White House, I believe. I don't think they've admitted that Valerie Jarrett was the one who was involved with that. But they haven't denied the fact that the negotiations took place.
Well, let's put it in a different context as well, that Israel, the American Jewish community, want negotiations to take place. Unfortunately, these negotiations should have taken place 5 to 10 years ago to begin with, or if the negotiations were ongoing, they needed to be coordinated with allies, not only Israel, but in this particular case, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia as well.
And right now, the United States' Arab allies, as well as Israel, are opposed to this agreement. Yes, at least as they understand it.
And there's a spin factor saying that their thoughts on this are either irrelevant or, oh, well, we'll take care of them, or they don't correspond to the same eventual goals that we have. In any case, it's, I think, as you alluded to, a byproduct of a foreign policy emanating from at least 2009.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that in a minute. I want to talk about this conference call today briefly first. So Jewish Telegraph Agency received a recording of the call, this conference call that happened today, on the condition that it not name the participants or fully quote them. And one of the things you have here is a think tank participant on the call said that Israel's posture, demanding a total halt to enrichment and the dismantling of all of Iran's centrifuges, was a path to war. And a White House spokesperson, a White House official, agreed to that reasoning, saying it was sound and said that given the choice between total capitulation and advancing toward a nuclear weapon, Iran would choose the weapon.
Now, there are several aspects that pop out here. The first is a halt to total enrichment. This is what the UN Security Council has been calling for in 6 to 8 different type of resolutions. And to differentiate itself from those resolutions is not good. It's divisive to begin with. Second of all, the UN has always offered to provide Iran with enrichment commensurate with a civilian program, and that comes with strings. You only get materials that can be used for civilian program of nuclear energy, and whatever it is that is expended in that process gets to be returned and recycled so that you don't keep anything that can be used for military purposes.
And the reason to want your own program to enrich, then, it becomes much more likely to be military and less likely to be civilian.
Well, this given the fact that the UN's IAEA itself is still not convinced that the Iranian program is dedicated simply to civilian, non-military purposes. If Iran wanted to dispel those images, it could have, within X number of years, provided the full access to the sites demanded by the UN. And when the UN was confronted with no, basically by Iran, it simply extended its time frame. And by extending its time frame, it's abetting the development of a program that ostensibly, for various reasons, has military aspects to it.
And so in this conference, evidently, the White House official, according to the JTA article here, sounded notes of frustration with Israel's pushback against the U.S. proposal for a first step deal that would exchange some sanctions relief for some rollback of Iran's nuclear program, saying it would provide Israel with a 6-month window to influence the shape of a final deal.
What can you roll back? We're dealing with technical specifics here. The first aspect, things have to shut down before they roll back. And we're not sure exactly what the terminology used in this contract is, but among the things that have to be shut down are the military site at Parchin, which is useful for military purposes in testing explosions, and the Arak heavy water facility, which produces, I guess, plutonium, which is useful only in military terms. So because we're not being given the specifics of this particular program and discussion, the idea of what is it that's really being rolled back, what is being terminated, and what type of inspections are going to be mandated at what sites. We don't have that information. I'm supposing that Israel has some of this information, and that its conversations with the U.S. administration have not been fruitful, either in disclosing what's really happening, or that the details that have been disclosed are disappointing to the Israelis.
Yeah, one of the things you have here is the proposed deal outlined by the officials. So we have a little bit more information than that, according to this article.
Let's see.
Would suspend uranium enrichment for 6 months at 20%, implying that Iran would be able to continue enrichment at 3.5% to 5%, address Iran's existing stockpiles of 20%, and 5% enriched uranium, suspend the development of a heavy water reactor that could produce plutonium, and end the installation and construction of new centrifuges. Now, I don't see anything there that's bad.
There's
the only
nothing...
question is whether or not it's good enough, right? Isn't that what the
question in whether it's effective, whether it's worth the expenditure of cash that has been heretofore embargoed, and what that cash will enable is Iran to do. But more than that, it calls into question Iran's right to enrichment. Dory Gold was on the internet today talking about there is no right to enrichment, that the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty does not guarantee anybody the right to enrich things for military purposes. And unless you'd like to engage essentially in the ambiguity of what is or isn't, they're probing something. They're going in a direction that's directly opposite to the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty itself, and therefore they have no right to enrichment.
And it's an issue, I think, here of there's a concern by Israel and France, I think, right off the bat, that the money would be released first in the hope that Iran would do these things, because it would take a while to make sure that all these things happen. And if you're dealing with a time frame that is not long as far as what Iran would need to do to get enough 20% enriched uranium and then enough beyond that to create a weapon, the time frame is very important here. What Israel's argument has been is that Iran has been too close to having enough material to have a nuclear weapon. It already is there, so that they need to roll back to move away from being so close to having a nuclear weapon before we could talk about shutting these things down. Whereas this deal right now simply allows the status quo at best on a number of these things and allows Iran to advance on other things, while relieving the pressure that would be necessary to force Iran to roll back anything. I mean, am I missing something? There's nothing that Iran is rolling back here. From what I can see, all we're talking about are various halts that in the best case scenario keep Iran on the verge of getting a nuclear weapon in a short period of time.
Within a system in which we do not fully understand what the redundancies in their production facilities are, and if they have other secretive areas of production that we learned about since 2002. The fact is, as even Tom Friedman says, Iran has been conniving and lying to get to the precipice of putting together a bomb over the last 20, 25 years. And if you don't see that, you haven't been paying attention.
And so we have a deal being put together and backed by the administration, which is now working on recruiting supporters to advocate for this deal, that leaves Iran exactly where it is, which is as a threat to have a nuclear weapon, and is causing great discomfort in Israel and Saudi Arabia and numerous other places. And you're going to leave that on the table while relieving sanctions.
Well, the broader context, again, is that Iran is a theocratic country that has indulged in disinformation and continually has rallies for death to America and death to Israel. So there's a hostility there that separates it, for instance, from other countries that might develop some sort of nuclear weapon plan that pose no threat to anybody directly. It's a different category, and by treating them as, oh, well, we'll believe them, we must test them. We must not test them. We've been testing them for the past 20 years, and they failed the test miserably. And to further test them is to jeopardize the security of various world countries.
Well, in addition to that, you'd also allow the regime to solidify its power. Now, we talk about the fact that at some point there could be a democratic revolution in Iran. That's much less likely if foreign countries aren't able to help revolutionaries at any point because Iran has nuclear weapons. So, I mean, there are multiple reasons here to work on trying to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons, even beyond direct strikes by Iran, or potential of direct strikes by Iran.
Well, and that's why I think that Saudi Arabia is so concerned, because there is this Shia-Sunni type of warfare that pits them against each other, and they certainly don't want to see Iran dominate the region itself.
Well, and Saudi Arabia has already evidently made an agreement with Pakistan to purchase nuclear weapons that they will have on Saudi soil.
Which was one of the byproducts that were brought up in discussion years ago, that if Iran is not stopped, it will create this rush to obtain weapons from various countries in the Middle East, which defeats the purpose of trying to promote deproliferation of nuclear weaponry.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of rhetoric about disarming Israel's nuclear weapons, but the country that they're really afraid of having nuclear weapons is Iran. You know, Saudi Arabia and Egypt haven't rushed out to get nuclear weapons because Israel has them. They're getting nuclear weapons because Iran is on the verge of getting them. And that should tell you something.
Okay, but we're dealing with culture as well, and I think people who don't share our viewpoint would say, well, you have to understand they're a nation of pride, and you have to cut them some sort of a deal to help them save face. We've heard this various times over the past year. Help Iran save face. But it's similar to the phrase, you don't make peace with your friends, you make it with the enemies. But you make peace with enemies who want to make peace. The fact is, there's nothing coming out of Iran that's peaceful.
Well, in addition to that, Mark, who's saving face? We need the Ayatollah to save face? I mean, why doesn't the Ayatollah care about the plight of his people? I mean, anything they do that it leads to reduction in sanctions will help the people of Iran. Why does the Ayatollah not care about that? Why you don't think that the average person in the street is going to say, you know what, we should stop a nuclear weapons program in order to get our economy working? I guarantee you they would. So we're aiding and abetting the Ayatollah in opposition to the vast majority of Iranians.
Yeah, well, people don't like the idea. Some people don't like the idea of regime change as a whole. And the Western powers have been against regime change for various reasons and because of what they consider to be destabilizing factor.
Yeah, but I'm not even talking about regime change. I'm just talking about helping the average person in the street. Why are we so concerned about what the Ayatollah feels when the Ayatollah has been oppressing the people of Iran? The Ayatollahs have been oppressing the people of Iran for decades. I mean, it seems to me that the people of Iran who need help are the people who would benefit by an immediate relief in sanctions. And if the Ayatollah doesn't care about that, I'm not so sure that the United States should be prioritizing it either.
Yeah. Again, to go back to context, I don't think either of us are arguing for no diplomatic relations or no deal. It's the nature of the deal itself.
We need a good deal.
We need a good deal. And
you also need a deal in which Iran concedes first, because I mean that's the big problem here, is that everybody wants to make concessions to Iran. At least the administration seems to want to make concessions to Iran and say, we're willing to work with you if you're willing to work with us. No. The answer is Iran needs to demonstrate that it's willing to work with us before we do anything.
Well, we need the resolve in order to push that forward. And
if not more resolve.
I'm not sure we have that resolve.
Well, I don't think we do, because I think right now our Congress and is very divided, and I think in particular the Obama administration is extremely separated from the Republican Party in Congress. So you have Republicans talking about tacking on additional sanctions against Iran in the military defense bill, and the president you have a thing here that says that, from this JTA statement, the official said, this is the White House official, said that the administration was confident that a proposal by a group of Republican senators to attach an amendment adding intensified Iran sanctions to a must-pass defense funding bill would likely not reach the floor of the Democrat-led Senate. What you're setting up here is something that very much divides Republicans and Democrats.
It's become a partisan problem. Look, there's nobody here arguing either for a military response. There's a lot of red herrings put out there that some people, this is leading to war by people who want the war for their own purposes. We're talking about something that's a pragmatic end to a very big problem.
Well, here's something that I saw as problematic a while ago, and I'm very surprised that the White House is engaging in it, and I think it's very bad. Look, fear-mongering is never a good thing, okay? And we're in a situation now where I thought it was only radicals who were bringing up this idea that Israel's advocating for war. If this JTA report is correct, then the White House is advocating that Israel is advocating for war.
Right.
In which case, the White House is wrong, and the White House is promoting hatred of Israel. And this is a big, big problem.
One of the problems, essentially, is the United States needs to keep on the table, actively in front of the mind of the world, that it's willing and able to use military force.
That there's a credible military threat.
There's a credible military threat, and neither Iran nor Saudi Arabia nor Israel, I believe, believes that there's still a credible military threat on the table.
And I think absolutely. I think you can hear that in the rhetoric of the Israelis that are talking about whether or not they need to act on their own because they don't believe the United States is going to act.
Well, that's true. That's the one aspect. If you don't feel that your main sponsor is going to support you and you feel yourself to be in an existential crisis, you're going to do what you don't want to do simply because the other alternative is worse off. But what we're hearing or not hearing, yes, we hear every now and then somebody says the military, all responses are still on the table. That's not good enough. I'm expecting Secretary of State Kerry to say point blank, we are going to use military force against you if you don't provide the basic relief of the situation we're in.
Absolutely.
And
he hasn't.
And he hasn't. And the second thing is, we are going to give you a certain time to conclude these negotiations, after which, if it's not concluded, we're going to reevaluate the situation and use what we need to do. So it's, certainly diplomacy tries to minimize these types of ultimatums. But we're not dealing with Canada. We're dealing with a country that is not fearful of standing by some sort of principles that are hostile to others, to begin with.
Well, we're dealing with a situation in which the diplomacy only works if there's a credible military threat. And if conference calls like this one, where you have a White House official saying, "Oh my gosh, they want war," guess what that means? It means that we certainly don't,
right.
And there's no threat of the United States doing any military action.
Well, again, this too threads back to the formation of the public policy years ago already.
Well, I think it's a practice of foreign policy that's the problem. I mean, for me, we can argue all we want that we don't want war. Okay, I mean that's true. We don't want war. But unless there's a clear willingness, unless somebody actually believes that you're willing to go to war, then you're starting at a different place. You're not conceding going to war for something else. The something else becomes the worst case scenario, in which case then you're negotiating further away from that. And I think that's what's going on. The best deal they can pull off with Iran right now is a bad one because Iran doesn't believe that there's any credible military threat on the table.
But it looks like, despite all protestations, that a bad deal is better than no deal at the present time. I could be mistaken, but that's what it looks like.
Well, from the U.S. point of view, for sure that's what it looks like. Now, then the problem is how does Israel respond to a bad deal? Is this deal bad enough that Israel then feels like it has to act anyway, in which case then you run a even worse problem? I mean, what happens if there's a deal that Israel realizes is allowing Iran to move forward with its nuclear program behind the scenes? Israel brings it up to the United States. The United States says we gave them 6 months, and Israel says, no, you got 2 weeks. What happens?
Yeah.
What happens? I mean, in my mind, Israel may well launch a military strike in the middle of the agreement.
Yeah, well.
Yeah, I mean, and if that happens, that's been discussed because I saw an article saying bringing up exactly that question on Times of Israel, and they said I don't remember what it was, Tzachi Hanegbi, who was bringing this up and said, we will act to defend our country, that he's sure that Netanyahu will act to defend the country if he feels like that's the way things are going. So you could set up a situation here in which the United States is not only not acting in the best interests of Israel, at least according to the Israelis, but could actually be acting. You could end up having Israel act against what the United States determines its best interests are. That's a disaster for U.S.-Israel relations.
Let me back up again and say what we've heard said by some people especially on the left, that the imposition of sanctions to begin with were a slap in the face to Iran, and that expecting Iran to do certain things is not consistent with universal practices of diplomacy. So, it's not that we haven't heard what the reactions to this policy are. The policy that seems that we're promoting is to drive a hard bargain because we don't have the luxury of settling for anything worse. But from the other side of the fence, there are people who are saying the United States should not drive a hard bargain for various reasons, and that already it's disturbed relations with Iran, but not taking into consideration the nature of the Iranian regime itself.
I am dismayed, I think, by the distance between the State Department's policies, the U.S. government's policies, and the Israeli perspective. If you'd asked me 4 years ago whether I would have expected this, the answer is probably yes. I would have expected the distance. Because
that's the direction it was going.
That's the direction it was going 4 years ago.
Despite all the assurances that this is the best relationship ever, in many aspects, look, it's not a unidimensional relationship. The U.S.-American relationship has to do with the relations between military forces, strategists, and diplomats, and on top of that, whatever foreign policy is enacted. So, when you're listening to somebody make a blanket statement, this was the worst ever relation or this was the best ever relation, you have to temper it with understanding that it's more complex.
Yeah, I think it's fairly clear that the Obama administration's support militarily, with military support and that kind of thing has been very good for Israel. The Israelis will say that cooperation
Absolutely.
At certain levels has been very good. The problem is this situation is so much more important to Israel than other things that have gone on that it dwarfs it. And so the problem is this one issue could well overwhelm everything else that the Obama administration has done for Israel by a long shot. And if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, that will terminate any discussion of whether or not the Obama administration was good for Israel, period, and will bring into serious jeopardy any argument that the Democratic Party is a party that supports Israel. This is a major problem going forward. And I don't think people realize how bad this is because the partisanship on this issue is setting up a situation in which the Republicans are putting themselves very clearly on one side of the issue and the Democrats are putting themselves very clearly on another side of the issue, defending the administration's position here. And if the administration fails in this scenario, it's going to be very hard to argue that anybody on the administration's side can be considered to be supporting Israel. This is going to be a huge problem. It's like you're not going to be able to apologize and say, "Oh, the website didn't work."
Right.
Okay.
Well, look,
this is an issue.
Let me ask you then, what's been the track record on the American foreign policy with other conflicts in the region?
Well, this is the issue that I wanted to talk about with what I would consider to be the Obama doctrine, and just going back to 2009. I mean, and I think this is really the telling issue. The Obama administration came to power with a belief that it had a mandate for change broadly defined, not only domestic policy but international policy. And the president's Cairo speech got most of the attention in 2009. But a few months later, he gave a UNGA speech.
I'll talk about the Cairo speech for a few seconds. The Cairo speech, he went to the Muslim world. He went to Cairo at Al-Azhar University, which is basically the most conservative pro-Muslim Brotherhood university in the country, invited Muslim Brotherhood members to come sit in the audience, and basically said, we're going to change the way we do business because the Bush administration messed things up.
And potentially led to the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt because of the outreach. I mean, there's some people who will say that he paved the way for that with that speech. But beyond that, okay, you had a situation in which that speech got all the attention, and shortly thereafter, the president speaks at the UN, and everybody's listening to the speech at the UN in the context of the Cairo speech.
That's right.
I think that has caused the UN speech to be lost. And there's some important paragraphs in the UN speech that I don't think people remember at all, but I think they're defining characteristics of this administration. 4 paragraphs. And one line in particular are very important. The time has come to realize that the old habits, the old arguments are irrelevant to the challenges faced by our people. They lead nations to act in opposition to the very goals that they claim to pursue and to vote often in this body against the interests of their own people.
What does that mean, David?
I mean, from my perspective, it makes no sense. I mean, this is the problem. I mean, first of all, it is impossible to conduct any kind of foreign policy without understanding the history of the conflict. And if you get into a situation in which you're saying that the history is irrelevant because you don't like the conclusions drawn from that history,
old habits, well,
then you're dealing with an extremely problematic issue. Let me go forward through this for a minute because
I think stay on that for a second. What are the old habits he's talking about? Old American habits or old regional habits?
No, I think he's talking about old regional habits.
Okay.
I think he's talking about the regional arguments. He's talking about Sunni-Shia strife. He's talking about Israel-Palestinian strife. He's talking about Israel-Muslim world strife. He's talking about all of these things. The U.S. Israel-Iranian problems, U.S.-Iran problems, conflicts with Egypt.
Thank you for putting that in perspective so that we have some concrete, at least guesswork about what he was talking about, because it wasn't explicit.
Yeah, I mean, my thought on it is that this is the doctrine. Okay, the doctrine is saying, in order to make progress in this region, we need to not deal with the history. We need to deal with the present.
Well,
and
to put that in another way, there are people who say, take a fresh approach, think out of the box.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not necessarily think out of the box. I think it literally is forget the history. Because the problem here is that if you really look at how the region develops, the issues that are unresolvable, that are intractable, are ones in which there's a long-term history of conflict. And so, for example, the Israelis are saying, look, Iran has attacked us in various places around the world. Iran is responsible for the Buenos Aires bombing. Iran is backing Hezbollah. Iran backs terrorism all over the place. You know, we can't allow them to have a freely operating nuclear program. And the president is saying, oh, you know, we'll control it. We can deal with, you know, don't look at what they've done in the past. Don't deal with the previous argument. Let's deal with where we are now.
I still think there are many who would argue the old ways of solving these problems were not satisfactory, that we have to think out of the box. Respond to that.
Well, look, it's always important to try new things and see if something else works. Okay, I'll give you that. But there are reasons that some of those options weren't taken. And you can't simply say, we're going to try it, ignoring the reasons that they weren't taken. Otherwise, you get bitten. It's like going to a zoo and having no signs that say don't feed the animals because no one ever remembers that the animals bite. I mean, that would be insane. We can't have a foreign policy that disregards the fact that nations have acted badly and that there are reasons that certain policies are in place. And that there are reasons that we have sanctions on Iran. There are reasons that we are not cooperating with the Muslim Brotherhood. To act as if there's no reason for those things, and we're gonna say they're irrelevant for how we should be acting now, is a very big problem. But it impacts numerous events. I mean, you can go through not only the way we're interacting with Iran now, the interaction with this administration and the Muslim Brotherhood, the interaction with people in Libya.
Yes, well,
you just go on and on and on,
yes,
country
but that's
by country.
that's a different assumption than an underlying theme that would assume that the United States was wrong in the past and that our new actions have to think out of the box because we were wrong.
I think you have two perspectives here that are a problem.
Okay.
I think the other issue that's being addressed when you talk about history being irrelevant is the relationship of those peoples to the United States.
Yes.
The political left, for sure, wants to talk about Mossadegh in dealing with Iran. And they want to say, oh, the reason the Iranians don't like us is because of CIA policies in the 1950s. They don't want to admit that there's anything else going on there.
Right. And you can elaborate in other parts of the world how the left would say it's all America's fault. If only America abandons its ways, things could go back to neutral, and therefore there will be a natural decrease in terrorism simply by rescinding the type of actions that we've made a mess of in the past. I don't subscribe to that, but that's what critics would say.
Well, I mean, look at the rest of the following few paragraphs here. They build up walls between us and the future that our people seek, and the time has come for those walls to come down. In other words, the arguments that have separated people should come down. Together we must build new coalitions that bridge old divides, coalitions of different faiths and creeds, of North and South, East, West, Black, White, and Brown. That's a wonderful let's all work together kind of statement.
Okay.
The choice is ours. We can be remembered as a generation that chose to drag the arguments of 20th century into the 21st, that put off hard choices, refused to look ahead, failed to keep pace because we defined ourselves by what we were instead of what we were for, what we were against instead of what we were for. Or we can be a generation that chooses to see the shoreline beyond the rough waters ahead, that comes together to serve the common interest of human beings, and finally gives meaning to the promise embedded in the nation given to this institution, the United Nations. A notion given this institution, I should say.
But it's so ambiguous and nonspecific that people could read into it whatever they want.
But I think the issue here is this: the primary issue here is not giving value to the old arguments. And as I said, from the Israeli perspective, this is a ludicrous notion. We're dealing with several thousand years of persecution here at this point, 2,000 years for sure, and some of these peoples will have the battles long even beyond that.
Right.
And we're dealing with a situation in which those battles of the mid 20th century are certainly not irrelevant to Israelis.
And so, how do you hear this in terms of the Sunni-Shia split?
Well, the Sunni-Shia split, what I think is that the Sunnis are saying you're completely nuts, and they're acting as if not only are they not irrelevant, but the defining characteristics of the current discussion. Mm-hmm. The defining argument here is a Sunni-Shia split for Saudi Arabia. The defining argument for the Israelis is twofold. One, Iran has made real threats against Israel, and Israel, the Israelis, the Jewish people, have already suffered a Holocaust in the 20th century. Ignoring those two things makes any discussion of helping Iran or working with Iran totally irrelevant. And this goes to not responding to Khomeini's speech also.
Right.
Because what that does is this argument that when the hatred is irrelevant, we need to work in practical terms. No, from the Israeli perspective, the hatred is very relevant. You can't make concessions to a regime that preaches hatred like that. Because from the Israeli perspective, regimes that have preached hatred like that have acted upon it.
Yeah.
And from the perspective of saying that, forget the 20th century, when all of these bad things happened, we're going to concentrate on the 21st century is ridiculous.
We all know people who would say that some of this rhetoric is for internal consumption itself.
Well, but not a UNGA speech.
Not at UNGA.
I mean, let's talk about the UN. This speech was directed at the people who we don't have a good relationship with. And it was directed at the people among our friends, particularly Israel, to tell them that they need to change their ways and work with their enemies.
Be more flexible.
I mean, that's what the Obama administration was very much doing.
Yeah.
And
But based on what? This is a utopian understanding.
Absolutely it is. I mean, my argument in 2009 is that we were looking at an idealistic foreign policy. And I think that in dealing with Iran, we're still to a certain extent there. And I do think that there are practical considerations being applied. I don't think the United States is going into negotiations with Iran blindfolded. But I do think they're not giving enough credence to the concerns, particularly of Israel, and to the Sunni nations about Iran as they're going forward. And so what's ending up happening here is that instead of working with Israel and the Saudis, who are our allies, and to determine what kind of support would be necessary, what kind of terms in an agreement would be acceptable to them, the United States has decided that argument needs to be set aside, because we as an enlightened nation can set aside those past disagreements and move forward. I mean, it's a very problematic position for the Israelis, and it's a very problematic position for the Saudis.
Now, for instance, it is the case that Secretary of State Kerry says, "I understand Israel's concerns."
Don't listen to them.
Don't listen to them. So if it's one thing if he would say, "I understand Israel's concerns," and then go on to elaborate what those concerns in public actually are. So at least we can hear exactly how he interprets or at least enumerates those concerns. We have no idea how Kerry enumerates Israel's concerns. What we're told is we feel your pain.
Yeah, well, and we're also in a situation in which Israel feels like the United States, and probably Saudi Arabia does as well, the United States is trying to build a relationship with Iran at their expense.
Yeah, and part of that expense is not articulating things that should be on the table in public. Instead of saying we understand your concern, we understand your concern that the Iranian government is terribly anti-Semitic. It has plans to eradicate Israel and is pursuing a military course in its nuclear production.
I mean, from my perspective, I think that the administration is not being sensitive enough to the history. And I think part of the reason they're not being sensitive to the history is this doctrine from 2009.
And part of that being insensitive is not being able to articulate not only to Israel but to Iran. It's saying, Iran, This is how we view it. We understand Israel has these legitimate concerns about your program. If you really want to address those concerns, we could come up with a good deal. If you refuse to address these concerns, we have to hold you accountable for not addressing those concerns.
Just because the nation that is feared to want to continue the Holocaust and wipe out Israel has a leader that calls Israel the rabid dog of the region, and that Israelis are not human, and the United States doesn't even respond to that when that's language that would be right in line with their worst fears. And I mean, to me, that kind of thing is the reason we're seeing this opposition. You know, I don't know if the Israelis would be unwilling to accept something relatively close to the agreement that's on the table. I don't know. They may want slightly more than what's on the table as opposed to a lot more than what's on the table. I do know that there is significant fear that allowing Iran to maintain the status quo of its nuclear program is not acceptable. And the agreement on the table seems to do that. That we're talking about no, continued growth rather than any kind of a reduction in what already exists. In other words, there's no penalty being paid by Iran here.
Now, every now and then we do hear something out of the State Department that says, yes, we are very cognizant that there has to be a rollback and this, that, and the other thing. But until it's consistently applied and not articulated by unknown spokespersons, all we know essentially are we can say it's Valerie Jarrett or something. We can say it's somebody.
Maybe. We don't know who it was.
We don't know. But if people are not at least willing to link their own names to these statements, it's basically leakage. These are leaks that are coming out of the State Department.
Well, and the issue is there are leaks coming out of the State Department that are designed to counter the Israeli perspective, which means that they're White House leaks to counter Netanyahu's public statements. And the problem here is I don't think the U.S. has responded to Prime Minister Netanyahu whatsoever. The United States' response tends to be, we know what we're doing, you need to shut up. As opposed to, you're wrong, we're actually putting that stuff in the agreement, which is what they would want to hear.
Now, obviously, there are some people who would say the United States has all the validity in acting this way because the United States is the biggest sponsor to Israel, and the United States has to act on global goals and not simply regional goals.
Well, look, I mean, Mark, I think there are a couple things that are an issue here. I think the first issue is that the understanding that Netanyahu's perspective is 100% right and the U.S. should follow Netanyahu's perspective may not be fully accurate either. I mean, I don't necessarily think that the Obama administration needs to agree with Benjamin Netanyahu. Certain people will and certain people won't. But they do need to take into consideration his arguments. And if they can't make an argument against his arguments and do it publicly and put their name on it, that's a problem.
Well, that's it.
The other thing that I think is an issue is this. It is the case that Israeli foreign policy and American foreign policy are not necessarily going to be in line.
For various reasons. We've spoken about because of the perspective of distance from the problem, size of the nations involved, and everything else that goes with it.
The problem comes when the United States says that it's going to take into account what Israel wants to see happen. And repeatedly, the Obama administration has made promises to stand up and prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon.
Yes, we're not talking about containment. We're
not going to talk about containment. We're not, and the problem here is, I think the Israelis are feeling like we're leading toward containment, that there's no credible threat to stop it from getting that direction.
And of course, especially people on the left will say, what's wrong with containment? We contained the Soviet Union.
Well, look, they don't understand how many people would be impacted by this. Yeah. I mean, allowing nuclear cover for terrorist operations that alone would cost potentially thousands of lives, if not tens of thousands of lives in the region going forward. I mean, the consequences of this are enormous. The expense would be enormous. Having nuclear weapons in places with radical terrorist organizations where they could rise up and take control of a nuclear weapon. I mean, what would happen if you had a Pakistani nuclear weapon in Saudi Arabia?
Right.
I mean, you could have potentially a radical uprising where they gain control of the weapon.
Okay.
And even if they use it only in the region, it's a problem. So,
Okay. Back to your policy analysis from 2009. What else?
well, I mean, I think that in essence, the argument here is that the old arguments are irrelevant. The challenges faced by are relevant to the challenges faced by today. That nations shouldn't necessarily abide by those old arguments, that long history, and that we need to work together in creating new ways of international cooperation. We just need to understand that that's not necessarily going to make the traditional allies of our administration happy. We're out of time. I'd like to thank Dr. Ronald Bergman and Bergman Folkers Cosmetic Surgery and Spa for their continued support of this show. I hope you have a wonderful Thanksgiving and Hanukkah coming up next week. And we will see you again on December 5th. Happy Thanksgiving.
If Tom Coates from Consumer Credit of America was your personal webmaster, Tom would filter out all bad debt emails. If Tom was your mailman, you'd never get any debt reduction junk mail. If Tom Coates was a lineman, he'd block any phone calls offering to reduce your credit card debt.
Hi, I'm Tom Coates with Consumer Credit of America, and we're still your best choice for credit counseling. We're local, we're accountable, and we can do more. You make the call when the time's right for you.
When it comes to competition, there really is none for Consumer Credit of America.